Mel Brooks line, did you choose to take this work of Shakespeare set in a frigid setting, I think, of Denmark and move it to 19th century, late 19th century Cuba, and particularly from your perspective, what, when you looked at this, I think you started thinking about it 2-3 years ago, what are these types of cultural conversations that you envisioned and now see developing with the fact that this will be taken to Miami in a few weeks after this premieres in Spanish here tomorrow evening?
Well, it's been a very interesting journey, and these two gentlemen here have been part of my thinking really from the very beginning, which is about 3.5 years ago now, where I first went into Linda Gabrielle's office and said, I have an idea. And she made the terrible mistake of not saying no. And she says over and over again, it's the hardest, it's the word I never listen to anyway. And it really, I mean, like so many, much of my thinking about the doing of theatre, and particularly Shakespeare, I'm always looking for ways that the work is connected to communities and larger issues, that we have a reason to do the work that we're doing. And very often, in my case as a director, it really is actor-driven. I'm inspired by actors, and I'm inspired by my relationship with actors. And when I first came to Florida 6 years ago, I knew nothing about Florida, really. And I knew nothing about Cuba and the Cuban-American story, except the most superficial things. And to be in the midst of it, and I kind of made it my business to find out where I was working, and what should I be doing here as an artist. And I began to meet all kinds of Cuban-American artists all around Florida. But in particular, I was meeting young, really talented actors who were completely bilingual and who had stories that were fascinating to me. We've had some of them go through our program. You may remember Equus, which was 4 years ago, with a young man who was a Cuban-American going through our program, very talented. And it was doing the work on that where I met his family, who were exiles. But his mother was an architect and his father was a doctor. So it began to kind of shake up the perception of Latinos for me. We tend to think of Latinos, we all have, stereotypical cliches about people in their race. I'm sure you all have a particular idea of Australians. And you've discovered that I am not Crocodile Dundee, except sometimes. And that was beginning to happen to me. My stereotypical understanding of what it is to be Cuban and Cuban-American. And I began to feel very strongly that I wanted to do a project at our theatre, that we are the leading resident professional theatre in the state of Florida, that we have a responsibility to do work that reflects that status and that mission, that it's not enough to put on shows and be entertaining, but that we have to be kind of a leader in terms of why culture is important, why the arts are important, and what theatre can do that no other art form can do. And I began to feel, meeting people in Miami, running theatres and so on, that there's no theatre like us in Miami, that I wanted to do a project that would speak to the larger Floridian identity, which accommodates the Latin American aspect of who we are, and that this is very rare. I came to Hamlet really because of my career most of my professional career, a large part of it has been directing Shakespeare and opera. But I need a reason to do that. And I just felt instinctively that Hamlet was the play, and that there was a chance to do it, as I always felt it was, a young person's play. That it's about three young men, Laertes, Fortinbras, and Hamlet, who are wrestling with how to be men and how to deal with a very profound idea, the loss of their fathers, and what to do about it if their father has been wrongfully killed, how they deal with vengeance. And I just had an instinct that vengeance, this whole note, vengeance informs much of our politics. And I started to read a great deal about Cuba and the Cuban story, which is fascinating, from the Spanish through to now. And there were a number of books that emerged as really kind of hitting my imagination and thinking about why to do Hamlet and how to do it now. The idea of setting it in Cuba came after the idea of doing the play at all. although I knew I wanted to capture the bilingual power of what these young American artists have right now, which is unique. I so envy the idea of being bi or multilingual as a language being our major way that we have a hook on the world. And Daniel's book, Cuba Wars, was one of the books, one of the handful that emerged that really reverberated within me. And I don't want to reduce it unnecessarily. It had a very profound idea in it, and the degree to which irrationality can inform politics and nations' relations with each other. And the notion of vengeance can actually be at the core of why nations behave the way they do, even though it's couched in all kinds of language that would imply that is not the case. So that landed very strongly with me, because the play has this deep interface of the personal and the political. In a way, it's about two families who are destroyed, by vengeance. And Dr. Andy Gomez was one of the first people I met to see, because I felt it was incumbent upon me to meet eminent Cuban Americans who are living and working in Miami, and I zeroed in on a few, and I heard about Dr. Gomez as the head of the Cuba Institute, which is the major think tank on Cuban American foreign policy. So I thought, I'm going to go meet this man and test the idea. And he's going to tell me, you're crazy, or you'll run with it. And I met with Mario Ernesto Sanchez, who runs the Miami Hispanic International Theater Festival. You must know him as well. And Eduardo Machado, and Nilo Cruz, and Ricky J. Martinez, all Cuban-American artists. And I said, look, this is my idea. This is what I want to do. But the first thing you should know is that I do not speak Spanish, and I'm Australian. I'm Australian-American. Do I have the right to do this? Do I have the right to come in and, as a kind of naive newcomer to the Cuban-American story of politics, but primarily from an artistic and rather instinctual point of view, do this play and set it in Cuba and work with Cuban-American actors? And to a person, they all said, you must do this. The support was absolutely unanimous. So that was extremely encouraging. So it's very gratifying to have both of them here now, 3.5 years later. The actual setting of 1898, I may as well just get this out of the way right now, is the third design pass at the show. It's been, well over 3 years. And the design team said to me that it's the longest design process they've ever had in the show, because I kept coming back with new information. And our first pass at the show was to set it in 1959, at the fall of Castro. And we did a whole design. You can imagine the look of that. I have many books on...
Fall of Batista.
Sorry, that's right. That was a real...
I
I must have been reading your mind. But so, the fall of Batista. And I was fascinated with all the revolutionaries, how young they were, how impossibly young Che and Castro and all of those people were, and the kind of religious fervor they had about changing the world. It seemed to me this would work amazingly well. But as we began to design it, fantastic books on what Cuba looked like, what Havana looked like in 1959. You all probably know much of that. It just seemed very sexy and young. And what happened, though, is when we got to do the designs and think about the casting, I felt that the play was being reduced to very easy political positions, that people were going to go, that's Che, that's Castro, and that they would immediately launch into very simplistic political notions about what the play was doing, even though I loved the look of it. So I then read another amazing book called The War Lovers by Evan Thomas, that you probably know, which really steered me away from the 1950s to 1898, which was the year that the Americans invaded Cuba, the sinking of the Maine. The Spanish fleet in Manila Harbor was bombed, and the Americans took the Philippines, and the Americans took Puerto Rico. That all happened in 1898, which was a kind of an explosive realization for me. And the book is about the thinking of the major political leaders, Teddy Roosevelt and Cabot Lodge and Henry James's brother and so on, they're thinking about why it was necessary for America to become a nation by engaging in a foreign conflict. That the wound of the Civil War would never heal unless they did this. Now, that was a fascinating insight into, and I felt that the 19th century setting was going to be remote enough to actually allow the ideas of the play to resonate without us being too locked down into a specific political prism, which 1959 was. There are a great many people living in our state who survived that and have many painful emotions around it. But 1898 seemed remote enough to be specifically Cuban, but also poetic and resonant.
All right, let me interrupt so we can make sure our guests speak.
Other people speak.
That's